Hey, I'm Jolt and welcome back to the Sketch Your Mind conference recordings. We're already at session 5 out of 16 and this one's a real treat. If you're new to the series, all links and resources are in the description below, including the giant Excalibur whiteboard where I'm collecting session highlights as the community keeps adding their takeaways. You'll also find something special for this video. Stephen has kindly shared his presentation slides, which you can download from the conference site. Now, this talk, Visual Sense-Making, is something new. Stephen P. Anderson, author of Figure It Out and founder of the Mighty Minds Club, presented material he hasn't shared anywhere before. And if you've ever stared at a blank page frozen by that, where do I even start feeling, this one's for you. Stephen takes that moment of paralysis and reframes it as an invitation. He talks about 3 distinct kinds of blank canvas situations. The inventory, when your job is to inspect and organize what's already there. The provocation, when your gut tells you that something's off and your task is to interrogate and explore. And the classic tabula rasa, when you're starting fresh, maybe doing research or note-taking, and your work is to capture, encode, and arrange. What I love about Stephen's approach is how he blends psychology, design, and play. He reminds us that structure isn't the enemy of creativity, it's the doorway to it. And one of his best tips is to listen to your language. Our words already contain visuals. When you say that something drives an idea, draw an arrow. If a concept sits behind another, literally layer it behind. Those small cues are building blocks of visual sense making. At the end of this video, you'll hear the music I composed for Stephen's session. If you'd like to support my work, you can get the conference album, join the next visual thinking workshop, pick up my book, Sketch Your Mind, or try the Obsidian Excalibur plugin. Everything is linked below. Now, grab your notebook, open that blank canvas, and let's see how Stephen turns hesitation into possibility.
Yeah, thanks for that intro. And this is a brand new talk. Some stuff I've tested in workshops, so you'll hear me refer to that. But we're going to take on probably one of the hardest problems in visual thinking, which is what to do with the blank canvas. And just to kind of get a pulse of who I'm speaking with, I did add a poll in if you switch over to the poll tab within the session, where I ask a simple question. Do you find the idea of a blank visual canvas? And when I say blank, completely blank, no templates, no frameworks, nothing, no game storming, nothing. Do you find that to be scary? What do I do? Do you find it to be manageable? I can get by, or do you find it to be thrilling? So many possibilities. And my goal by the end of this talk is to move you from, if it's scary, to at least manageable, if not thrilling. And if you're in the manageable, maybe you'll fall into the thrilling camp by the end. But I'll keep an eye on that poll as the talk goes, and you can answer in any time. But let's get started. And I'm going to share my screen here. Give me a moment. And I'm gonna flip between Keynote and one of these visual drawing tools. But I want to start with just showing you something that you may have noticed, you may not have noticed because it happens so quickly or we get used to it. I'm going to go here to Miro, and I want to create a blank canvas to begin working with. And when I go to create a blank canvas, you'll notice I don't get a blank canvas right away. I actually get this modal that says, do you want to use a template? And if we flip over to mural, let's go create a new mural. And you'll notice something very similar. It asked me to give it a name first, but then blank canvas time, right? Blank. Oh, nope. They want me to pick a template to work with. And let's look at one more. Let's look at Fig Jam here. And if I click in Fig Jam, Will I get a blank canvas? Yes. Oh no, they it's a little less in my face, but they also want you to use templates and diagrams. The reason these companies do this is they all know something from the data that's consistently true. Most people, when they encounter a black screen, never come back. When you talk about retention and engagement and things, most people, and by most, I mean the overwhelming majority, and I know this from having worked with one of those companies, when they encounter a blank screen, they never come back. So that's why these templates are such a great and important things. Things like Miraverse, where you share templates. These are key to engagement and getting people to actually stick around and use the tool and start learning it. Because blank screens are scary for most people. And I don't know who I'm speaking to today, if you're in that most people category, if you're in the minority of the world that like actually loves this stuff. But this is the talk I wanted to take on. This is the topic I wanted to take on. Is the blank screen. What do we do when faced with a blank screen? And there's a great quote I just came across a few weeks ago that really brought my talk into focus in terms of how I'm going to organize things. This is from Dan Saffer, and he's talking about student projects in his class he teaches. And I'm just going to read this. It's the only quote I'll read throughout this whole talk, so don't get scared. The blank canvas problem isn't just about the absence of content, but about the lack of initial direction. When users are faced with a completely empty starting point, they're forced to invent both the material and the structure in order to make progress. This often creates hesitation, slows momentum, and makes starting a task the most difficult part. And then this was teeing up a student project where they use AI to solve the problem. And I think this next part could apply to templates as well. We can reduce this friction by designing tools that scaffold users' early steps, enabling them to efficiently find the direction towards their goal. But I thought this was a great description of the blank canvas problem. And what I want to do in this talk is take us from the blank screen problem to how do you use visuals to make sense of stuff. And the reason I'm giving this talk is I am a visual sense maker, and this is the label I've only arrived at recently, but it's something I've been doing for at least the last 25, 30 years of my life, my career. I brought this visual way of working to everything I do. That's shown up in user interfaces. It's shown up in facilitation activities that I've led. It's shown up in canvases that I've created, makeovers and medical charts, concept models that I've done. That one and with the pyramid looks like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. For whatever reason, that caught and had a lot of traction. So for the last 20 years, a lot of people know me from that model, even though I've done dozens and hundreds of models. I also use visual thinking for personal things. Like recently, I went shopping for a rice cooker for my wife for her birthday, and did a lot of investigation into the world of rice cookers. And gosh, the e-commerce sites out there and even the vendor sites don't make it easy to find the right model that fits your needs. So I created something for myself for personal use. And three models I created in the past few months that I've written about. One I created, and this one kind of went viral. It was, what does a product manager actually do? And this was mostly I created it for myself to make sense of what does a PM do, and I blogged about that and shared my thoughts. But it also helped organize not just for me, but for other folks, which is why I think this one took off and resonated. And there's a whole blog post about every piece of this map that I've created. I also created a framework to help me make sense of my feelings about AI and AI concerns. And it's really just 5 or 6 stacked boxes, but the concerns basically are practical, economic, ethical, cognitive, and environmental. And then I acknowledge the existential concerns and kind of dismiss those as well. So that's a simple framework I created to organize my thoughts around AI concerns. And then on a much more personal note, and again, this was never meant to be a visual, but I wanted to capture the thinking. I've been cooking more Korean recipes this year, and that's something new. And there was a particular recipe, Jajangmyeon. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but it's a noodle dish, but it's very different from traditional Italian Western noodle dishes. And so I had to form a mental model of how to actually make it and what ingredients were critical, what were optional. And so this was a visual I created to kind of, after I'd made it a couple times, I was like, this is the map, right? This is the high level, the guide. And this, if you work with me, this is how I work every day. So the top half of the screen is just rough ideas in progress, mostly for me as the consumer creator. And then as I start to share stuff out and invite people, I clean it up, tidy it up, and you see a screenshot from below where I've done exactly that. So this is how I work. So visual sense making is life for me. You know, the whole football is life from Ted Lasso. Visual thinking, visual sense making is life for me. And just one thing I want to call out early on is every one of these visuals began with a question or a bundle of questions and a blank screen. And so the product manager one, it was actually in the title of the post. What does a product manager actually do? The peace framework for AI. The question I had was, is there a useful way to organize my AI concerns? How do I make Jajangmyeon? Which rice cooker should I buy? Not seen here because it's what I do on my day job, but what does OT cybersecurity monitor? That's stuff I've been figuring out and working on. So first tip, and I'll share 4 or 5 throughout this talk, start with a framing question or questions. I generally you're going to have multiple questions, but I generally double down on one question that you want to have. But I'm getting ahead of myself just a bit by sharing tips, doing a little more of the framing before we get into it. What I want to do with this talk is demystify what happens from the moment you have a question until you have a visual. And the visual could be just enough to make sense for you. It could be something you want to publish and share with the world or share with the team. But I want to demystify that process in the middle and what happens here. And just to kind of give you some positioning and some framing, a lot of folks could step at this point and talk about sketchnoting. This is not sketchnoting and not a sketchnoting talk. And I would say what I'm going to share kind of falls between data visualization and what you'll hear from Dave Gray when he talks about his visual frameworks, in that a lot of the ideas and a lot of the things I focus on, you can find written about in data visualization textbooks and charts, graphs, and that is talks about spatial arrangement and visual encoding. So that's a lot of what I bring or focus on, bring to the conversation, but it's not about data or numbers or things like that. It's all about concepts and ideas. So how can we apply spatial arrangement to these concepts and these ideas? And so it kind of falls halfway between these two things, what I'm going to share. So stated a bit differently, my goal for this talk is to make this thing, the blank canvas, whichever tool you use, a lot less scary. And when I say whatever tool you use, it could be Miro, Mural, FigJam, like I kicked off with. It could be TL Draw, Excala Draw, Obsidian Canvas, Heptabase, Cosmic, Noti, Freeform. There's others that goes on. I want to make this thing a lot less scary for anyone who logs in and isn't sure what to do with the blank canvas. And this also applies, a lot of what I'm going to share, not everything, but a lot of what I share applies to a blank sheet of paper as well. I want to make the blank canvas less scary, but not just less scary. My goal is to make it thrilling and exciting, because when I see a blank canvas, I get overjoyed because there's so many possibilities and things you can do. But I also understand if you're not sure what to do or how to move through a blank canvas, it can be scary. And I want to address that. Are you ready? I'm looking at the chat here. I want to see a few people say, yes, you're ready for some solutions. Ready. All right, good. All right, so I want to come back to this quote from Dan Saffer, and I said this kind of framed or organized the talk for me that I want to give, and what I doubled down on was the words material and structure. When we encounter a blank canvas, we're forced to create both the material, and I'm going to change that to content, both the content and the structure. And just those two ideas, I started noodling on those and thinking about that. And before I get into the blank canvas, I started looking at other areas where we have a blank screen, but we don't freeze like we do with a blank canvas. And one of those is a text editor. Like all of us open text editors, document editors, and we start typing. So why don't we freeze there? Why isn't there a fear there? Mind mapping tools are very popular. A lot of people open and use a tool to mind map and do thoughts, concept mapping, it's also called. Templates, we use templates all the time. They're empty and blank, but they don't have that same sort of terror that a pure blank screen has. And facilitation activities, like with sticky notes and things, we're okay with those. And I started thinking about it through this lens of structure. And while all of these have no content, they do have a limiting structure. So with a text editor, there is a limiting structure. It's the linear, almost typewriter inherited structure, kind of the 1D structure that we heard about. Mind mapping tools have a branching structure. So they branch off. One idea branches off of another. Templates, whether it's canvases, frameworks, maps, whatever you want to call it, those boxes and those circles with labels, those are guidelines. Those are rails to keep you focused on whatever the purpose you hired that template for is. And with facilitation activities, there's often a facilitator who has those games, those canvases and frameworks in mind, whether they're emergent or prepared ahead of time. So there is a limiting structure in all of these. In contrast, the blank canvas starts with no content and no defined structure. And so this is how I'm going to structure and organize the talk, what I'm going to share. As I've been thinking about the blank canvas situation, there is the pure tabula rasa situation where no content, no structure. I'm going to end on that. I'm going to start at the bottom with kind of a less difficult blank canvas situation, which is you don't quite have content, but you have concepts or ideas that you're trying to organize. And what do you do there? And then we're going to talk about the provocation, and then we'll end with tabula rasa. So let's start with the inventory. And with the inventory, how we're going to respond is we're going to inspect and organize. And I call this visual inspection with a heavy emphasis on the inspection part, which is what I found most people kind of skip past or don't give the appropriate amount of time. And basically what we're talking about is you have a concept, a bunch of concepts. They're roughly similar, same types of things, and you want clarity. You want to organize it. So I mentioned, shopping for a rice cooker. Have a bunch of rice cooker options on one side. I want to know which one to buy, right? That's the clarity I'm seeking. And some examples, and these are things that I've used in past workshops. I've collected all these concepts on cards, business size cards. And here's one. It's types of gatherings that we have. And you have things like a class, a conference, a symposium, a seminar, a workshop, a meetup, a banquet. You can see how these are all similar, but distinctly unique, different types of things. So if the clarity was organizing these in some model that made sense, how would you go about doing that? Here's another one. These were a bunch of words I started collecting that all just happen to start with the letter C and O, but they're all kind of related. So cooperation, co-ownership, co-creation, collaboration, competition, conflict. And so this is another exercise that in my workshops, I have folks organize into a model. And then there's also, this is one hopefully we can all relate to and maybe it's not just a US thing, but on food packaging, there's use by and best by and sell by and delicious if used by and enjoy by and freeze by dates and all these things. And you go to grab something, you're like, well, can I eat this or not? And then we inevitably look up the answer. What if there was a visual or a chart that made sense of this different language and which types of food it applies to and what to do, right? This is begging for some clarity. And I'll share one more example. This is a model I'm working on. So the model is not there, and the content I'm still gathering. But visual thinking, I found, is kind of a loaded phrase. It can mean a lot of different things to a lot of folks. So I've started creating a model. And right now, again, it's still at the inventory, collect all the pieces stage. But I'm collecting all different ways or examples of visual thinking. So you have graphic recording, you have sketch notes, which are very similar but different. You have these very popular visual metaphors. That's usually a 2-panel frame that uses metaphors to explain a concept. You have business consulting, you have frameworks and canvases, you have experience design, you have all these things, information design. So I am making a map or model working on that will make sense of all the different flavors of visual thinking. So concepts, clarity. What happens in the middle? That's what we're here to answer. I'll tell you what most people do. In my experience, what most people try is they inevitably grab for a framework, and for whatever reason, it's always the 2x2 or an XY matrix, and they start plotting this. And they might change the labels on the axis, but everyone goes straight for doing this, which is fine as a first pass. But what I try to encourage people to do are two things: try out more visuals and inspect the concepts, like really, really inspect the concepts, and keep doing this, because this isn't a linear thing. This is something that happens in tandem, happens together. So on the try out more visuals, in my years, decades of experience, the best thing I can say is just exposing yourself to more and more models and actually consciously and intentionally cataloging and capturing those in some referenceable way. It's the best thing you can do. And so this is a bank of a kind of a starter bank of models that I've created. And in my workshops, I encourage people to add to it and make it their own. But that's the best single tip I can offer you for like expanding or getting better at invoking structures, is just to build up a bank of visual primitives. And so, like I said, this is a starter kit. These are pretty common. You see a couple different 2x2s in there, but you also see some things like a honeycomb or stacked planes, some more creative ones. And I'm always on the lookout for interesting visual primitives or other visual ways to represent stuff that aren't common, that could work or that I could try on in different situations. And two I've come across in the last year. One was this idea of, whenever we draw a continuum, we always think of extremes, and the farther away from each other they are, like the more unique they are. But what if the extremes actually come back and align or unite in some new way, right? And so here you see a model where it's seriousness to playfulness. But what if like deep seriousness and deep playfulness shared or had in common mystery and complexity, right? And so I looked at this and I stripped away the actual content. I'm like, wow, what if our extremes actually wrap around and meet again at some new way? Then here's another one that I picked up, and I've seen a couple of variations on this, but it's with using a triangle. And if we label the edges of a triangle, and we can actually give a label to different combinations of whether it's one or two or all three of those edges and how it shows up. And I look at that and I'm like, okay, it's going to be a very niche pattern, but that's an interesting pattern to hold on to and try out in the future. So that's try out more visuals. And again, just exposing yourself to lots of visuals is the best thing you can do in that case. Inspect the concepts. When I say inspect, I mean really inspect, like look at the concept. So if the concept is the word, co-working, well, what does that mean? And like, what are examples of, and just digging into that. And this GIF from Toy Story 2 is the best example, where you have the guy with the glasses zeroing in and just inspecting the details and fixing Woody here, right? This is what I'm talking about. So in my workshops, when we work on this, we actually don't start with concepts. We start with physical objects. And to make it a bit fun, I don't tell people what the objects are. There's 3 bags to choose from, and groups decide which bag they're going to pick. And the instructions in the workshop are, they're going to place all the objects on a flip chart sheet. They're going to organize the objects in a meaningful way. And when you go and grab a bag and bring it back and dump it out on the flip chart sheet, you're going to get something like this. So this bag has all different kinds of dice. And if you look closely, you can see like they're not all the normal 6-sided dice with pips, dots, right? Some of them have numbers. They're different colors. They're different sizes, different sides, right? Some don't even have numbers. They have letters or words. So that's one team. Another team might grab a different bag and they dump it out, and it's kind of a mixed bag of things, right? So stuff you'd find in the junk drawer is, I guess, the best we can say about this. So you see a die, but you also see a domino. So those are things you can play with. But then there's like a light bulb, right, and yarn and like tools, things you use, a screwdriver. So it's kind of a mess. And I actually love using both of these because it yields different lessons and results, which I'll comment on. Here's a quick pause. Why do you think I start with physical objects as things to inspect versus concepts? And I'm just going to pause, take a drink of water, throw in your guess in the chat. I'm going to see what you. Why do I start with objects, physical objects? Definitely playful. You can literally grasp them. Literally, yes. To attract the trainee's attention, yes. It definitely engages us. Yep. Familiarity. Yep. A lot of these are familiar. I'm not picking obscure things. Externalized ideas. These are all fantastic. Easy to grasp the fundamental concept. Yep. These are all really good. A tangible version of a broader, more overarching concept that bridges in the abstract. Yes. all of those are spot on. It's fun too, right? I think that was playful was used, but it's a bridge. One of the things I've found is a lot of the skills that I teach and things I wrote about in my book. We already kind of innately have these skills in many ways. It's just we often can't cross over from using these skills for very literal things to very abstract conceptual things. And so one of the things I try to make people aware of is you already organize things in your world all the time. Food in your pantry or your fridge, clothes in your closet, books on the bookshelf. If you're making a really complicated recipe with lots of ingredients, you might line up the ingredients and then push them away from you as you use them, right? As a signal that you've already used that ingredient. So we use space in our world already all the time, just by nature of being embodied human creatures. And what I'm trying to do is get people to recognize that and then bridge that to these more abstract conceptual ideas. So starting off with something very tangible, we can start talking about things like the material of this die is plastic. It has 6 sides. It's small. It's red, right? It's very easy to pick apart and inspect these things. With the mixed bag of things you'd find in a junk drawer, you start to see a blend of things that are literal, like the material is glass and metal. But then you see some things that are a bit abstract, like teams will inevitably talk about the safety level. Well, glass could break. Some of these other things are toys, but this is not, so it could be dangerous, right? Or um, is the purpose functional or playful? Like purpose is a popular attribute that comes into play. So you start to see these more abstract things enter the picture. So that's round one, inspecting the concepts, trying out more visuals. We talked about that. Another thing I just quickly want to comment on is in the process of inspecting visuals and inspecting the concepts and trying out visuals, you're also playing with another idea I tried to seed, which is objects and spaces. And there's more on this I could talk about, but if you take a space like a map, and there's actually lots of spaces on the map, and they take objects like push pins, all the places I've traveled or been to, you have this fundamental idea that's I think is common or universal to almost all visual representations, which is you have objects arranged into spaces on a board. And what you're playing with in these exercises is which data goes where. You're inspecting these properties and you have to decide, is this data that's better represented in the object, right? Especially if you're custom creating something, or is it better represented in the space with a 2x2 or a Venn diagram or a literal map, right? You're asking, where should the data, the attributes we're observing, where should it go to communicate the idea? So the round one's a lot of fun. You can see photos from some of the various exercises. So things that are useful, things that solve problems, things. So they got nested boxes as the visual strategy. This other one was branching like trees, and that was the way they organized it. You've got these radiating out circles for, I think it was age appropriate. This was the dominant thing from infant out. And then you got this crazy one, the lower left, it's like a messed up Venn diagram. But these are some of the things that the groups create. And it's a lot of fun. It takes like 20 minutes. But then we go to round two, which is concepts. And teams can pick between the yellow one, which I think is a little bit harder, more conceptual, or the green one, which is a little more literal, not literal like physical, but it's easier to grasp those attributes. And teams decide what level of challenge they're ready for. And with these conceptual ones, you'll notice all of the attributes tend to be, you have to bring them to it. They're all observations. So you were kind of practicing that with the mixed bag of stuff. Like the purpose of this light bulb is functional. It's breakable, yes. But with a workshop, a concept like workshops and symposiums and things like that, with concepts, you have to, it's all abstract, like it's all conceptual. And so you're kind of bridging this exercise you just did with this new exercise. And I emphasize, I want you to inspect each of these cards exactly the same way you inspected each of those objects, because they all have attributes. You need to make those visible, tangible. You need to talk about them as a group. So what happens here? This is the visual that I've arrived at, and it's informed partly by some work from Oliver Cavaglioli, who's also speaking this week. It's also the organized boxes, the 3 ways to organize things come from Dave Gray. So it's kind of a building on their work. But there's kind of 4 overarching steps. You want to select the things that you're going to organize. And within selection, there's collection and curation. And sometimes, like as you inspect things, you'll curate them more. The with the dice, those are heavily curated. They're all dice. And but with the stuff you would find in a junk drawer, that is just collected and not curated at all. And one of the mind blowing comments I heard in one of my workshops was, um, when you have things that are alike, you can focus on all the differences and what makes them distinct. But when you have a mixed bag of stuff, just a random collection, you're focused more on what they have in common. And I think that's an important lesson when we talk about curating things: is how narrow, how focused is your creation, or is it more broad? And that's going to affect the type of inspection and organization you can do. So I encourage people to really curate things around a very focused topic. And then we have inspect and organize. And again, I throw out pictures there. Dave Gray talks about organizing by sequence, comparison by system, or a mix up or a mashup of those. And usually what follows then, and again, it's not linear, you can bounce around, but what follows then is iterating on that, sharing it with other folks, getting feedback, refining, tightening it up, maybe going back and re-inspecting and organizing. But this is the process that I've been able to observe and call out of this approach. One more comment on this. I want you to look at these concepts, and in the chat, just quickly comment what's different about this collection of things. Before we had things like dice and we had things in a junk drawer, but what's different about this? Yeah, they're all coffee related. This is all related to brewing coffee. There's an order. Yep. It's a combination of objects. So they're not like things. So if I said I'm going to do a coffee visual and we're going to look at different types of coffee beans, that would be consistent with the examples I've shown up here. But in this example, you have light roast, grind size, Kalita wave, water temperature. Um, they're all parts of a whole. So, and what I want to say about this is visual inspection, as I've described it, it applies to comparable things. So types of an X, right? Rice cookers, dice, right? But it also applies to parts of a whole. It's just when you go to organize it, your organizational system's a little bit different. It's going to focus more on organizing by sequence or relationship, because these are parts of a bigger whole that all relate to each other. And if you're curious about how this one turned out, again, we had light roast, dark roast, REO V60, although this was the visual I created there, and it answers the question: brewing, pour over coffee, what are all the considerations? And it starts with beans, and there's all different types of beans and things to think about. Then your water, your grind size, the ratio of water pressure to time, filter, brew method, and whatever you add to your coffee to give it additional flavors. So that's the visual that came out of working with these concepts. All right, so that is the inventory, and don't worry about time. These next two are going to go a bit more quickly. The provocation. So this is something I call visual interrogation, and it's a little bit different from inspecting ideas. You want to interrogate concepts, and I'm actually just going to show you what that looks like, because I think modeling is the best way. But this usually starts for me not with a collection of ideas to work out, but it starts with a statement that, while on the surface is true, is really begging more interrogation. And you have statements like, mistakes are how we learn. That's true. Is it the only way we learn? You have things like, you can either innovate, imitate, or get left behind. All right, that sounds good. Are those my only three options? And are there flavors there? And could I innovate and get left behind? Like, the customer is always right. So there's some truth in that, but what about when they're not, right? Or what about when they're toxic or just evil, right? All lies are bad. Are they? Like, aren't there some healthy lies, well, white lies, all that? So these are all provocations that are begging inspection. And just to show you, how or what I do with something like that. I'm gonna take this one, which I've wrestled with years, like competition, whether it's a good thing, bad thing. With my kids, we actually focused more on sports where they would compete with themselves, like skateboarding or snow skiing or running, things like that. But most of the world thinks competition's a great thing, right? And doesn't have an issue with it. So this was an idea I wanted to wrestle with, and I'll just go share my visual interrogation of this concept. So, and I'm just going to go through this quickly, but what I want you to see is how I'm interrogating the concept and the emerging concepts with different visuals, different patterns. And so the first thing I usually like to do is a spectrum or a continuum. So if you have unhealthy competition on one end and healthy on the other, what would fall there? I'll often find just simply flipping that spectrum, like from horizontal to vertical, can make a huge difference in how I see the problem or I'm framing it. Um, Oftentimes a third or second dimension will enter. So maybe it's not unhealthy and healthy, or in addition to unhealthy and healthy competition, you have it's not worthwhile or worthwhile. And you could start testing this with examples. This led me to ask, what is healthy and not worthwhile? And I couldn't really put anything up here. So then I modified the visual more. So it's okay, maybe it's like there's healthy competition, which is always worthwhile, right? That's this latest evolution. But then you have unhealthy competition that has no justifiable outcomes or justifiable outcomes, right? So you start to see a model emerging. And then I started testing with it more examples and thought about like competition at different levels from local, like maybe like locally maybe it's high schools competing all the way to global, the Olympics. And then maybe you have two sides, unhealthy and healthy. Thought about some more, and I think I had trouble like coming up with things that were unhealthy and healthy at this global level. So I kind of converged those and said, okay, is it high national stakes, high communal stakes, high personal, high low? Again, keeping the unhealthy and healthy. And again, testing with examples is really good. So I threw in examples like a track meet and running, but also like playing board games, right, where you compete. And I'm a huge board game fan. I had to reconcile that. And then I changed it a bit. I said, what about the source of the competition? Maybe it's externally imposed, or maybe it's internally self-imposed. Maybe that's another way to think about this. And then I was like, who are you building on that idea? Who are you competing with? Myself, others, lots of others, everyone. So you can see I'm just interrogating this idea and seeing where it leads. And one interrogation leads to another, leads to another. And then I started thinking about the effect of competition on me personally. Does it energize? Does it drain me? Because for a lot of people, competition energizes, right? And does it motivate, demotivate? And that brought to mind like this idea of Csikszentmihalyi's flow or the will skill matrix, right? And so I started invoking similar frameworks to look for other ideas to poach. And I continued on like this. And ended up with different visuals. And this was all about 45 minutes. So everything you see here was about 45 minutes of me playing with ideas. And I finally kind of where I dropped off or settled was this metaphor I'd encountered at work. And it was the idea of a barbell, right? Or you're lifting or weights, right? You're lifting weights at the gym. And you can think of the negative, the downward stuff as the weight you're pushing down, but the healthy internal drive, motivation, grit is you lifting up and pushing force the other way. And that's where I dropped this off. But this is what I mean by visual interrogation. And just to be clear, this isn't going to happen overnight. This happens from years of experience of playing with different visuals. But the handout that I share with folks is something like this. So it's taking those visuals that you saw earlier, but focusing on how many concepts are embedded. Are we in two concepts, three concepts? And like the moment you have a third concept, for example, you can have triangles, you can have a bracketed spectrum, you can have Venn diagrams, you can have things like that. You can have concepts that aren't equal in like in geometry terms, things that like this flame down here where you have the core and then things fanning out, or levels or planes or a comet, right? So I hand this out as kind of a guide to folks to help us do visual interrogation. And before you ask the question, yes, I'm working on a card deck version of this to help us all with visual interrogation. So that is on the horizon. So that is interrogating ideas. And now let's end with the pure tabula rasa, where you have no content and no structure. And how to respond, I would say capture, encode, and arrange are the verbs that we want to think about. Capture and encode, I'm going to bundle together, and arrange, we're going to talk about separately. Though, as you'll see, you do a little bit of arrangement or pre-arrangement when you're encoding things. Let's talk about capture and encode. So if I convince you to start using a tool like Miro or Mural to capture notes, don't do this. Like, don't just start capturing notes and placing them in the grid or placing them down here. If you do so, you're just bringing with you the baggage from like a linear note 1D note taking tool. You don't want to do that because you're not getting any of the benefits or advantages of putting things in a free-form space to begin with. You might as well stick with a note-taking tool. So the tips I share are the universal one that I think we know from workshops: one idea per sticky note, right? I tend to use a rectangle sticky note versus the default square for note taking. Again, depends on the volume of the content you're taking, but I tend to prefer this. I left and top align the text for readability. And I advise everyone to use one color initially and then start adding colors where there's meaning. And again, I'm thinking more about personal note taking or note taking with one other person, and stick with the default size. So Miro, a lot of these have a default size. Go stick with it. Don't go, resizing it until there's a reason to do so. So what note taking might look like as you're capturing notes. And I've done customer user interviews. And as I was capturing notes, beforehand, I would put all the questions in one color, right? So question 1, 2, 3, question 4. And then as we were doing notes or taking notes, usually me and one other person, I would arrange them like close to the question, right? And in some cases, like this is a distinctly different answer to this, but these two were like related. So I'm actually using spatial arrangement to put these closer together. Maybe this was a great quote, and so I add an icon, and it's super frictionless in a lot of these tools just to add an icon, right? That's fire, right? Maybe from this first question, there was another follow-up question. So I go over here and I copy that and I add my follow-up question and then come back to it later on. Sometimes you hear stuff that's just like, oh my gosh, and the best response is to drag in a GIF, right? And so again, a lot of these tools make it fairly frictionless to do that. So I'm going to put shock, right? And you could drag that in, and that's a way of adding comments without even using language, right? You're just adding this meta comment. And again, when you're looking at your notes later on, it's going to be easier to make sense of or go back to those things you flagged in a way. Maybe something's really important that someone says, so you make it bigger and you give it a border, right? Super easy in Mural, not so easy in Miro, as I've learned, to just simply add a border. Maybe someone says something that you want to capture, but it's not relevant, so you change it to gray, right? So you are encoding the information as you're capturing it. I'll share one more over here. Maybe this was a question and the answer is like, well, first you do this, second you do this, third you do this. So literally capture that in a stack, right? So you have that visual representation of what's being described, using language. So that's what I mean by capturing and encoding the information. Use color, size, grouping, border, connectors. Be intentional with the use of these things. Change colors when it means something. Add a connection to indicate these things are related. These visual encodings, by the way, they're not just making these up. They're not just fun like stuff to do in the digital whiteboard. They actually have decades of research behind them, and there's different things that the human eye picks up on more quickly than language or words or conscious thoughts. And so there's a lot of research behind this. Another tip, and you've heard this from a couple of presenters now, add illustrations or icons to the text. This is the idea called dual coding. And so as I'm taking notes, I don't do this all the time, but sometimes I'll add an icon, and you saw how straightforward and simple it is. For the visual I'm working on types of visual thinking, I need those visuals, right? They're not just a reinforcement, but for other things like where I was working out visual interrogation, adding the icons for competing with self, competing against others, team competition, like those help me start to organize things. And by the way, a lot of these you can get, like, again, with the search tools built into these tools. If you want these for publishing something later on, like my brewing pour over coffee, those all came from the Noun project. And you can go there and find, I don't know how many millions of icons they have. So it's easy to add icons to reinforce the words, right? What you're using. Sometimes the images are the thing. So this was me shopping for I believe it's a macro lens camera. And you can see I've color coded green the cost. I've added the label at the top and added some comments below. Again, I use visual SenseMaking for everything. Finally, let's talk about arrangement. And I'm talking specifically more about not the pre-arrangement where you're kind of grouping and clustering things, but arranging things into intentional areas or spaces. So that's this top row: group, place into, nest within, place in close proximity to. Sequence, think about how you can sequence things by rank, time, dependencies, etc. You could literally do the boxes and arrows thing. You could do like I can't remember what they're called, but these rank order charts, right? You could stack cards and give them colors to indicate a sequence, right? There's different ways to do this to communicate information. And then connect. I actually have a few slides I wanted to share around connection. So I've been doing a lot of recently some AI research. And of course, when you ask the same query of different AI agents, or if you tweak your query just a bit, you get very different results. And I am naturally distrustful of these results. And so what you see here is in the blue text is the answer to one result. And this was about like product features and putting them in a must have, should have, could have bracket. And the black text is another second query with a different prompt. And what I'm doing here is I'm reconciling the answers from one prompt to another just to see, like, did they align? How far off are they? And for me, this is where the learning comes from, is when I am inspecting the answers or the text coming out of these LLMs by reconciling it in this visual way. Also, like, this was when I was shutting down the Mighty Minds Club as a centralized private community, something more decentralized. Had to figure out where would all the stuff that was in this core tool go and where would it exist. So using connecting lines there, and you can see the thickest line, again, the visual encoding, the thickest line was, I want to continue with the Friday finds, which became the newsletter I share. That was a definite thing. But some of the events and things, how am I going to support those? So using arrows to show this transition from one state to another. Final thing, I know I'm over a bit, well, over the 30 minutes I budgeted, but final tip, listen closely to your language. And this is something I picked up just in recent months, helping others or coaching. Writing out your thoughts can reveal how to draw your thinking. And so I want to just share a quick example there. And this is a blog post I'm working on as well. So I'm not talking about common practice, like, shipping containers get placed on the trucks and we do boxes and arrows. I'm not talking about that. What I am talking about are things like dual coding. So the school offers an open house for parents. So give those icons, right? But maybe the metaphorical language can be interpreted literally. So the steps to do this are, all of these are blocked by this. The barrier to this is, so it's not just the nouns, but it's these other words here. Sometimes you can visualize it in ways that are a little more abstract. So the relationships, this drives that other thing. So you could have this and someone pushing on that, right? Maybe it's not adding an icon, maybe just using this arrow, right? This arrow, it's clearly leading into or guiding, this drives that other thing. This unlocks, I think our first reaction, or my first reaction, was like a lock, right? But the more I started coaching and trying to figure out what this person wanted, both the drives and unlocks were more like steps. Like, if we do this, it'll allow us to do this next thing, which will allow us to do this other thing, and then we can party, right? So inspecting our language will often reveal things. The school offers an open house. I sat with that word offers and I was like, what does it mean to offer something? And I could have done this, right? But the more I thought about all the things the school offers, it's not just one thing, it's many. And I started thinking about a platter, like a food platter. And so a school could offer lots of things. And this was my first pass of an abstracted version of a platter, but it doesn't have to be that busy. I could just use lines, right? But my point in all this is, in our language, we often have the visuals that we're looking for. The biggest challenges. So if you have a bunch of challenges and this is the biggest one, make it the biggest one, right? This might lead to, give it a gray dotted dashed line that indicates we're not sure. It's not certainty, right? If it's thick and solid, like, then it's certain. This is not. maybe, change the color. Sometimes the placement of things is in your language. So sitting behind all this is, so literally put it behind this, right? And this is part of, right? So there's nothing keeping us from taking these default sticky notes and just, resizing them and, putting it behind all of these, right? So we can do that. Maybe you have this thing at the bottom, so put it at the bottom of the stack, right? So all of that to say, I think if we listen closely to our language, oftentimes the visuals are embedded in our language. So wrapping up, 3 kinds of blank canvas situations and how to respond. I've gone through the tabula rasa, the provocation, the inventory. Thank you very much.
Awesome. This was mind-blowing. I have a huge canvas full of notes, unbelievable size of canvas. We have a whole bunch of questions and people have ranked them. So if
Okay.
you flip over to Q&A and on the right-hand side you organize by popularity, then they can just start following popularity. Where
All
can I
righty.
find a visual cheat sheet with all the options to try out?
I ran out of time to prepare like one of those forms that you fill out and I ought to send. So we're just going to keep this old school and casual. Send me an email address and I will send you any of the visual cheat sheets you saw today. Um, I don't know what floodgates I'm opening with that, but my email address
Yeah, well,
is
you can also post here in the on the event sheet we have documents. So if you have a list of items and you put it into a document, then we can just simply upload it to the event documents, and then it's going to be available for people. I
yeah.
don't want to block you making new friends and having lots of emails, but it's just a suggestion.
Let's do both. I'll put them in the event docs or the session docs area. Well, you can help me make sure that happens. And then if you want to email me about any of this, it's my first name at poetpainter.com. So that's the best way to reach me. And I'm always happy to make new friends and chat about this. My
Yeah.
mission is to convert everyone in the world to a visual sense maker or awaken the visual sense maker that's already in you. That is my
That's
purpose.
the one I agree with. We are already visual sense maker. We were just trained out of it by
Yep.
school. Can these slides be made available for reference later?
Same answer as the documents. Yeah. I'll make these
Oh,
available.
awesome. Okay, so what is your visual thinking tool of choice?
So I listed all those tools initially because I'm popping between those and pretty agnostic. And honestly, so I worked at Mural for 4 years, and so I use that a lot. And I know there were things in Miro that I was envying. And so now I've been working in Miro, and there are some cool features and things that Mural didn't have. But I also find like there's some little things Mural has that Miro didn't, right? And those are the top 2 like big visual facilitation tools. FigJam's pretty good. It's got some interesting tech capabilities that I'm eyeing, like automating stuff, syncing between devices. One of my priorities, which none of those solve or satisfy, is local and personal and private. Like if these tools shut down, I still want
I
my
can
data.
offer a solution.
Yes, yes. So that's why Excalidraw and Obsidian Canvas and Obsidian Excalidraw are there. Nodi as well, some others. They're all like, honestly, this is still a very early and maturing phase. There's still so much potential for the digital whiteboard. And so I move fluidly between a lot of those tools. And it depends on whether I need to bring people in for collaboration or I'm doing it purely for myself for note taking. So I reach for different tools for different purposes.
Cool. So there's a question here by Brand, curious how the emotional decision-making content is represented in these curations.
I think I would love elaboration on that, the emotional decision making content. Yeah, I would love clarification on that. I don't know that I know what to answer.
Maybe Brad, you can jot something in the chat, and in the meantime, we'll move on to the next one, and we'll get back to this. So, when do you think it makes the most sense to use analog visual sense making versus starting with digital visual sense making?
Yeah. So again, it depends on the context and your needs. So I demonstrated things like it's effortless to add, to rescale, to scale stuff, how to border in the digital environments. But there's some good stuff you can do in the analog as well. And so um, I've definitely converted to leaning more towards digital for most things, mostly because like I work with people who are distributed and remote. You have a record of the information. You can automate the exporting of data later on. So there's a lot of upsides, but getting people together in a room, there's a lot of intangible stuff that happens. And, you know, even like just folding a piece of paper or doodling on it, it happens more naturally than it does digitally. So it really, uh, yeah, I don't know if that answered the question exactly, but I go for different analog versus digital in different ways, in different times, different contexts, and um, the biggest driver is going to be: are we meeting in person? Or are we meeting digitally? And by and large, most of my time is meeting digitally, remotely. That's how I'm working with others.
Yeah, and it was interesting yesterday, Dave Gray's session. You can also watch the replay if you're interested. That Dave was making a huge argument for digital and virtual, even
Yep.
sending people to cubicles to meet because it offers so much. How do you integrate non-digital tools into your visual sense making explorations?
Ooh. Non-digital tools in the visual. So I'm going to answer what I think the question is. So I demonstrated mostly digital tools, but I'm also I could show you a sketchbook where I'm often sketching a lot of these things as well. So the only reason I was able to show you the visual interrogation of the my feelings on competition were because I did that in Mural. That's normally something I would do in a sketchbook, right? And you would see a sketchbook filled with doodles. That's just how I more naturally do that type of visual interrogation process. So I definitely used both. Um, I didn't mention, but I have a lot of notes. I use Bear App for my notes, and I'll move fluidly between Bear App and Mural or Miro or some of these tools. Again, because they're different tools that activate our brains in different ways. So yeah, I think, but there's still that divide. And I don't know if this is embedded in the question. There's still that divide between analog or digital, and there's some early things like photograph the wall and it'll transcribe like it. But I'm really interested in this is a whole different talk, different tangent, but like stuff like what Brett Victor is doing with Dynamic Land, where the physical and the digital are kind of one and the same. So you put out a card on the table and it projects something on the screen and changes the data. Like those types of things get me ridiculously excited when we can start to blur the lines between what is physical and what is digital. And it's almost like bringing digital capabilities and dynamic stuff into the physical world. And that thrills me to no end. I love that type of stuff.
Awesome. Um, so I'm new to visual thinking. I always start with a drawing and writing on paper. Do you have any tips on how to transfer this to a digital tool?
I mean, start playing and get comfortable with the tools. Um, and again, they're the different tools for different purposes. I actually find Mural is easier to like, double click and add a sticky, where Miro, you have to click and drag it out. Miro has some upsides for advanced users. So I find if you're starting out, finding one of these tools, play with it. And Mural is actually pretty good for people who like this is their first time. Play with it, get used to it. And pretty soon, like scaling and adding a border and changing it can become second nature. I would say just practice those digital skills, and you've kind of crossed the threshold when you can take notes as easily or effortlessly in Mural as you could like in a text editor. And that's where I try to get everyone first is like, let's start taking our notes here. Otherwise, I'm copying and pasting people's notes into into these tools and then doing all the encoding and the arrangement, right, and making sense of the notes. So yeah, if you can get comfortable just capturing your notes in a tool like I would say Mural is a good starter one. That's probably the where I would start.
Awesome. So Brian has a question. Can you share a real-world example where your visual process interrogation led to an actionable breakthrough idea?
I mean, I think most. So
Rice
there's
cooker shopping,
a lot
actionable
of this
real
stuff.
world.
The rice cooker shopping, a lot of the things I'm making stuff like the models I publish, whether it's professional or personal, I'm making sense of stuff for myself. So I want the answer, I want the clarity. So having the answer is the end. Other times, like, and I read about this in my book, but when my oldest son, he's 26 now, but when he was 4, he was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, and we got a medical form that was just, it was all text and really difficult to make sense of. um, and if you don't understand it, you can actually like give your son or daughter, your child, too much insulin. So the nurse will spend 30 minutes with you walking through this 1-page form. And that was something I did a makeover on. And my goal was to make it something that he, as a 4-year-old, could look at on the refrigerator and know exactly what he needed to do, and manage his own diabetes. So that to me is a winnable outcome right there. There's tons of stuff that I just can't share with the world because it's work related. But I mean, the things I create are the things that facilitate conversations or catalysts to other things, decisions being made, and that I'm making those every week. Like there's something that frames a conversation, or it's a way to synthesize research so we can make a decision. And yeah, and those things never make it out. Because proprietary reasons, but that I'm doing literally every week. I'm creating things like that.
Awesome. And well, our time is up. Maybe just one last question that has 2 upvotes still. So where do you think AI is most helpful in the visual sense making process, and where do you think AI is the least helpful?
I have a post, so that making sense of AI concerns shares a lot of my thoughts. My focus is on cognition and thinking, and so much of learning and thinking is active, and it's the active we being active and actively interrogating these ideas. And I find that asking an LLM for an answer is passive and doesn't encourage that kind of learning. So if you're going to use an I encourage you to actively inspect that. And so running the same query across 3 different LLM models and then putting those in some place where you have to reconcile the differences, and there will be differences. To me, that creates the conditions for active learning. But in general, like I do not take output from an LLM and dump it in and you run with that, because I find there are holes, there are blind slides, and I'm not getting anything out of that. I'm not learning. So I encourage all of this as a way of actively constructing your own knowledge and playing with ideas. I think that's key. So I use AI, but carefully, because my focus again is learning and cognition.
And Chris Suzanis is going to talk about integrating comics along similar lines, at least based on the earlier
Yeah,
conversation.
it's
So that's going to be, so he's keen on you actually need to do the thinking
yeah.
yourself.
Nick talks
AI
about
cannot.
that. You talked about writing. Writing is a form of thinking, and visual, like it's an active thing we have to do.
I
We just
actually made a note as you were talking about that you need to write down to help you come up with or identify the visual, because that actually helped me. The surface and depth method that we did yesterday, it clicks. So you first
yeah,
think about it, you articulate it. It's same in my visual um, concept visualization process, that you need to articulate the idea before you draw it. So I think articulation and visuals are the same. Anyway, we need to close up.
yep,
Stephen, it was a blast. Recording is going to be available here under replay. Um, Thank you. And then if you send me those docs, I'll make sure I post them uh, here in docs, but also in the event, the main event docs list. I'm going to just post those documents, and then it's available for people to grab.
perfect. Well,
Perfect.
thank you very much, and
Thank
thank
you.
you all for
Thank you,
joining.
everyone. And it was good fun. Bye-bye.
Yeah, 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 yeah. got a mess on the table, a chaotic collection. A scribble on paper, demanding reflection. This is the quest to see the connections, to put your mind to the test. Oh. Look at the canvas, cold and stark white, junk drawer of ideas hidden from the light. We need the inventory of spatial design. Take scattered concepts, make a coherent line. Transform the scribble into an insightful flow. Turning messy data, letting clarity grow. It's more than drawing, it's the structure beneath the underlying patterns where the real truth can breathe. Step into the lab, let the analysis ignite. Turn the abstract shadows into crystalline light. Oh, the clarity strikes. A sudden transition, fast and slick. It's visual sense making. From blank page to big picture, we interrogate claims. We find the critical trick. The logic reveals the true and vital fixture. Yeah. Now for the interrogation, a system of stress. Got a bold statement, put it to the test. Pull it apart with spectrum, sequences and systems. Challenging assumptions, breaking down resistance. From passive note-taking, don't just sit and wait. Turn the blank page into an active mental state. Stephen P. Anderson, he wrote the book, figure it out. Foundational grammar, that's what it's all about. Unlocking the patterns, dissolving all the myth, yeah. Wrangling complexity through visual riff. The dialogue is rigorous and the focus is sharp. You're building the framework of functional chart. Oh, the clarity strikes. A certain transition, fast and slick. It's visual sense making. From blank page to big picture, we interrogate claims. We find the critical trick. The logic reveals the true and vital fixture. The clarity shake is visual sense making. From blank page to big picture.